Welcome to the Music is My Life podcast from Berklee Online. I'm your host, Pat Healy, and this episode I want you to take note of Joe Wong. He has been in and out of indie bands since the late 1990s, starting a touring life at the age of 17. He has played drums for the likes of Marnie Stearn, Parts and Labor, and Mary Timony, who we talk about in some detail since Mary Timony produced his recently released debut album, Nite Creatures, which is a surprising exploration in psychedelia. Joe also has a career in scoring for film and television, composing music for Aziz Ansari's Master of None, Natasha Lyonne's Russian Doll, and the trippy animated show Midnight Gospel. He's also the host of the weekly podcast, The Trap Set, which he started posting episodes of in 2015, interviewing other drummers. He's since expanded the format to include all musicians. Joe spent 2 years at Berklee, followed immediately by a retreat to a farmhouse in Wisconsin where he says he would play music for 14 hours a day. But Joe's musical life began at the age of 4, with a special gift that may or may not have been delivered by his favorite musician at the time. Let's let him tell you all about it.
I don't really think that I knew it was possible to become part of this industry or that it was even an industry. But when I was 4, I remember getting a copy of Thriller for my birthday. I can still vividly remember the day. I remember my dad was selling a car through the newspaper. I was 4 years old, so I was down for a nap, and I remember hearing people coming to buy my dad's car, kind of falling asleep and waking up, and my mom had the Thriller record for me as a birthday present, and she told me that Michael Jackson had stopped by to drop it off. You know, I was too sleepy, so I didn't wake up. And in retrospect, it's kind of a creepy image to conjure, but I was really upset that I didn't get to meet Michael. But that was an early obsession.
Did you have the one glove that you decorated?
No, I didn't do any of that stuff. Like, I didn't have the outfit or anything. I would try to emulate the moves unsuccessfully, obviously. Yeah, that was the first music that I can remember getting obsessed with on my own. I don't think my parents were big Michael fans. They weren't not fans, but I mean, he was pretty ubiquitous at the time. I was heavily drawn to that music and still appreciate it. Still love it, actually.
So when you got that, was it a cassette or a record or?
It was a record, and I would play it on my Fisher-Price turntable.
That's great. And was it so much of an obsession that you're driving your family crazy, or did everybody embrace it? You have a number of siblings too, right?
Yeah, but at the time I only had 2 siblings. I'm the oldest of 5. I think my parents probably thought it was cute that I was into music. Soon after that, I started getting into all sorts of different stuff. As far as like feeling like I could participate, that didn't happen until I started playing drums when I was 11.
Mm-hmm.
I had played piano starting at age 6. And then in elementary school, we had an orchestra program that started in 4th grade when I was 9, and I played violin. And then band started in 5th grade, and I chose clarinet. And then after 5th grade, at the beginning of the summer when I was 11, I started playing drums. And there was a guy that lived a couple blocks from my parents' house who had a drum studio in his basement and would teach lots of the folks that came out of Milwaukee at that time. It finally felt like, oh, okay, this is a vehicle into that world. This feels relevant to the music that I'm listening to, and I feel like I can enter into it. Because I was listening to mostly pop music and rock, and there isn't much clarinet present in that, in those genres. And I wasn't even really aware of clarinet-centric music at the time. It was just, something that it was a class in school. And
Mm-hmm.
I can remember feeling, some sort of visceral joy from playing in orchestra and just feeling the sound that generates when a couple dozen kids are playing together. But it really took off when I started playing drums. It just made sense intuitively to me. And soon after that, I started playing in bands.
What was the first thing, I guess on the drums probably, that you played that you could replicate the sound that you loved, basically?
Just like a 4/4 rock beat, it felt like, oh, a light bulb went off. This is what I'm hearing on countless recordings. And it's interesting because I can remember when my brain started being able to hear the different instruments was around that time versus hearing it as a whole. I was able to then kind of run it through the prism of this new mind I was developing and started to hear, oh, that's the bass, that's the drum set, that's the guitar, that's the keyboard. I hadn't really heard music that way before.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So you're playing the drums and you start playing with other kids. How do you get connected with other kids?
There was a guy that lived up the block from me called Eric, and he had a guitar and an amp, and we started playing together. And that really was the bug that bit me. Once I started playing drums in a room with other people, that's when I knew that's what I wanted to do with my life.
That's great.
Maybe.
What kind of no, I mean,
there have definitely been times in my life where I wished I would have had that same joy in managing a hedge fund or something.
You're in that room and what kind of stuff are you playing?
Well, I can tell you, it was my parents' basement, and we knew 3 songs, or maybe Eric knew 3 songs on guitar. It was Enter Sandman by Metallica, House of the Rising Sun, and Come As You Are by Nirvana.
Nice.
And we would cycle through those songs over and over. I was 12 at the time. I got my first drum set, about a year and a half after I started playing drums.
And then from there, are there neighborhood gigs where you play those 3 songs, or is it still in the room for a long time?
It was, yeah. At that point, it was, just us in the basement. And then there were some other kids in the suburb where I grew up that were a little bit more advanced. There was some 12-year-old kids we knew who could play like Steve Vai songs on guitar. At that time, there aren't enough people around that you can find musicians to play with who share an aesthetic with you. It's just like, let's jam. Let's find anybody that plays an instrument and try to do something. So we were playing just a crazy range of music at the time. And then when I was 14, I joined a band with some kids from the other side of town who were writing their own music. And that was the age I was when we started, playing out.
What kind of stuff were you doing in this band?
That band, the other kids were really into Weezer, who had just put out their first record. And I was into 80s punk rock at the time. So it was, again, kind of incongruous. The singer of the band was in theater. So it was, the delivery was kind of theater, was Broadway-ish. Then I was listening to Dead Kennedys.
Cello Biafra's delivery, in a way, can be a little bit Broadway-ish.
Very theatrical, I guess. Again, it was just, you don't know that many people, so you try to make music with the people that you know or the people that find you. I thought that it was pretty great that these kids were writing their own music at such a young age.
Yeah.
It was a fun experience.
So from there, where do you go to find the kids who have the same interests as you?
Well, I had already met my best friend with whom I started the band called Acarso, but he had another band, and actually the band I was in made a split 7-inch with his band. And again, it didn't really make sense for those 2 bands to be on the same record other than, as a cost-sharing thing, and that we were all friends. But when his band broke up, then he and I started playing music together, and our tastes were aligned. And the kind of stuff that we were interested in at the time, lots of the artists that were in kind of like the second or third wave of Discord records out of DC. Mm-hmm. And then some of the really fast, I guess they would call it like power violence, or I thought of it as the heroin bands from San Diego, Antioch Arrow, the Locust bands. I mean, the Locusts weren't really part of that original crew, but lots of the artists that were on Touch and Go records out of Chicago, Don Caballero, and, very mathy, lots of parts, lots of shifts in time signature. And it was the first band I was in that toured.
And so who were some of the bands you were sharing bills with around that time? So what is this, like 2000?
No, this is 97.
97, okay.
So who were some of the bands that we shared bills with? Well, one of the bands that I was just thinking about is the Paper Chase, which was the band that John Congleton had back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And John famously went on to become a Grammy-winning producer for people like Annie Clark, St. Vincent, Angel Olsen, Sharon Van Etten. Lots of the bands that we played with, you wouldn't remember, and I wouldn't even necessarily remember the names. But I do remember, I think our very first show, we played with a band called Rainer Maria, who later went on to New York. They were living in Wisconsin at the time. We had some friends in Milwaukee that we would play lots of shows with. And who did we play with on tour? I mean, I could name a bunch of band names that you wouldn't recognize. But I was thinking about the Paper Chase because John was on my podcast recently, and I was remembering the first time we met, and it was in Denton, Texas, at a rehearsal place that also did shows called Rubber Gloves.
That's cool. So you're touring nationally at what, 16 or 17?
17.
Wow.
At the time, you could buy a gallon of gas for under $1. At some places in the South, I think it was as low as 80 cents at the time. And a bean burrito from Taco Bell was 59 cents. And so I think we would average like $30 a show. And we were playing in basements or DIY spaces, and in some cases, small clubs. And then we had T-shirts for sale, which were, either really cheap undershirts that we would buy and then screen ourselves, or shirts that we would buy from thrift stores and screen. And then we had 7 inches and CDs, which we sold for $3. We were really influenced by bands like Fugazi, who tried to keep everything really affordable at the time. Plus, we lived with our parents, so we didn't have to reap giant profits, nor did we have any delusions that was even possible with the weird music we were making.
And how were they supportive of you going out on the road at 17? Or
yeah, I think that they recognized. Well, first of all, when you have 5 kids, one of them is expendable, right? I was heading to college the next year, so I think they were letting go. I think they realized that this was something that I was really passionate about, and I think maybe they were impressed that I was able to book a tour at that age and actually make it work.
Was that part of your college essay?
I don't know.
So I know you did spend some time at Berklee, but did you, when you went into college, did you go in with music in mind, or were you going to do the hedge fund thing?
No, I wasn't going to do that. First of all, I just didn't think of music. Coming from a punk rock background, I was apprehensive about making money playing music. When I went into school for my freshman year, I went to the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and I was studying computer science and English. And I thought maybe I would get a job as a computer programmer and then do music on the side. But then, as you mentioned, the next year I decided to go to music school at Berklee.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the punk rock background, because I imagine that must have been its own hump to get over coming to Berklee.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I think I was ready to explore approaching music in a different way. And I also had a fair amount of formal music education at that point. As I mentioned, I was in music programs in school, and I also took lessons. So I don't think that was a problem. And I was ready to try looking at it through a different prism.
And how did that prism look?
Well, you're studying something that had kind of organically grown out of a specific community of free thinkers and intellectuals. And, I remember when I was at Berklee reading the Miles Davis book, and he's talking about attending Juilliard briefly and how he ultimately left because it felt too white. And then he later goes on to talk about this notion of museum music and how once something becomes codified and studied in that way, that it becomes dead. And I was like, oh, well, that's exactly what happened to the music that he made. And that's what's happening at the school that I'm going to. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think that music should be taught in schools, and it should be revered. And people should appreciate it, but it's just a tricky thing,
Yeah. Did you find a niche for yourself, though, amongst other students? Or did you, like we were talking about with, finding people who have the same taste as you? Was there anybody at the time?
No. And I tried really hard, but it just felt like I wasn't on the same page as really anybody there.
Mm-hmm.
I would go outside of the school. I remember I was in a student club at MIT that was open to non-students. And I was, since I had toured, I had lots of friends that were playing shows at places like the Middle East or TT the Bears.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go to shows and see people that were on tour. But I think my hopes when I went to Berklee were that I would find like-minded people and be able to start a band or maybe multiple bands. And I really just didn't find anybody that was on the same page as me. And some of that might be because I wasn't in a place where I was receptive to that, but I don't know. It's a type of isolation that I haven't felt subsequently.
Oh, I'm sorry. So you leave Berklee after how many years?
2.
Yeah,
but I wanted, before we move on, I don't want to sound like I'm completely anti-Berklee necessarily. I just didn't find my people there. That's all.
Right.
I think there were some benefits of going there. I think the most important one is that I kind of transitioned out of that mindset that I was going to try to be a computer programmer or do something quote unquote legit and then have music as my passion on the side.
Mm-hmm.
It was the time when I kind of decided, okay, well, I'll throw myself fully into this as a life and look at it as my primary calling, which is even more than an occupation, just
Right.
kind of honoring that feeling that I had since a young age. But, growing up in the community that I grew up in, I didn't know any professional musicians aside from my drum teacher and my band director. So it didn't really seem like a plausible thing to do with your life. And so I think going to a school where everybody was pursuing that and where I would come into contact with people that, had made a life for themselves in music was a positive thing.
Well, it seems from, what I know of you that the pursuit of your calling is important to you. And a lot of the choices you've made have been in like experimenting with that and trying to get there in different ways. And it's almost like what I imagined this farmhouse in Wisconsin for 14 hours a day was like, all right, I'm not getting what I want to from formal schooling. Why don't I just immerse my own self in my own sound?
I think that's right. I think I was trying to determine, well, first of all, I just had to metabolize all the information that had come flying at me when I was at music school and decide, what material I wanted to incorporate into my style and what I wanted to discard and what it all meant. And I wanted to, like, one of the things I liked when I was at music school was it was really the first time in my life that I could really devote the entire day to working on music, which is a luxury. And I wanted to keep doing that, but see what happened if I kind of created my own structure rather than having it imposed on me. I had a cousin who was renting a cheap farmhouse, and she was back and forth between that place and another place where her boyfriend at the time lived. And I had the opportunity to move in. I think I was paying like $100 a month in rent or something like that. And so I went there and just played all day long.
Wow. When you think back on those days, do you remember specific breakthroughs or anything?
No, I don't. I think I didn't really know how to structure that much time. So I think, I don't know if I made any breakthroughs.
But it must have had some benefit.
It sounds romantic, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I don't really know how I benefited from it. I probably did get some benefits. I think I was also going a little nuts because I didn't have any human interaction. And, music is an innately social endeavor. So it was kind of like if I had gone to Juilliard to become a dancer and then moved away from civilization and danced by myself all day long. I mean, I don't know how productive it was but it was something I wanted to do. So for the short period of time that I was there, it probably did something.
Why is there something like when we talk about music in those terms, it sounds noble, but when it's dancing on your own for 14 hours a day, there's something almost sad about it.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think I romanticized people like Sonny Rollins, but when Sonny was doing his bridge studies or his bridge discipline, whatever you want to call it, he had already figured out to some extent what his musical identity was, and he had something to say that he was trying to get to, I would assume.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know what I wanted to say anymore. I feel like I had sort of established a musical identity before I went to school, and then kind of discarded that, went to school, tried to kind of build myself up from scratch, and I wasn't sure who I was anymore. So maybe that's why I was at the farm, is trying to just figure out what I wanted to say.
Were you recording as well, or just playing?
A little bit, yeah. And I wrote some songs that I threw away.
Yeah, nothing made it onto Nite Creatures after all these years.
Oh no.
Yeah.
And by the way, this was the same town that Justin Vernon is from.
Oh, okay.
Right outside of that town. So Justin Vernon is from a town called Eau Claire, and this was the adjacent town, Chippewa Falls. If only I would have saved those songs, maybe it could have been the Bon Iver.
Right.
Maybe I could have been Bon Iver before him.
Well, I mean, wasn't that his whole ethos, or it was just like playing alone in the beginning, like in some remote place?
Yeah, I mean, that's what he did for the first albums he went to. I think his dad's hunting cabin somewhere and recorded that album.
Right.
But again, I think, he's somebody that had been in several bands before that and had maybe a more clear direction. At the time, I was just trying to find a direction.
So, but then one of your friends comes calling and you join their band, right?
Yeah, a friend of mine who I'd made, again, a split album with my band Acarso and their band Farragut in DC. The guitar player from that band called me to join a band in DC. So I moved to DC.
What was this band?
It was called Sound on Sound. Our existence was very brief. And again, it didn't work out. I think partially because I was still trying to figure out who I was as an artist. So that was partially it. And then other reasons that had nothing to do with me.
I'm guessing interpersonal chemistry and band dynamics were probably at play.
Yeah, things like that.
So then that didn't work out. And then is that when you began scoring commercials?
Well, I started scoring films.
Okay.
So shortly after that, I moved back to Milwaukee, and 3 friends of mine were co-directing a movie called The Yes Men. And another friend of mine and I were asked to write some music for it. And it ended up being the first film that I scored. The film ended up going to some festivals and getting a distribution deal. It wasn't a huge hit, but it was a great movie. And it was a fortunate break right out of the gate.
Yeah, what year was this then?
This was 2003 that I scored that. And I think it was released at festivals in 2003 and then probably came out in theaters in 2004. Maybe it came out in theaters in 2003.
Is that something that immediately resonated with you, doing that type of gig?
Yeah, it was fun. And DDA LaPlay is the guy that I worked with for the first 10 years of my scoring career. We had good chemistry. We worked really quickly together, and we had very different aesthetics in some ways, but we had a pretty large intersection of things that we both liked. So it just kind of started this new phase. And at the time, I wasn't like, this is going to be my primary career. I thought of it as a supplement to playing in bands.
But it was, guessing, a lucrative supplement when it comes to...
Not right away. I mean, I think I got paid like $800 or something like that for that first movie, even though it got a theatrical deal. And I don't think that the filmmakers were screwing me over necessarily. I just think that once they paid themselves back, and since the movie probably didn't generate huge profits in the theaters, that's all they could offer.
Right.
And what happened is one of the directors went on to become a pretty prominent commercial director. So we started a company that wrote music for ads, and that subsidized my life as a fledgling film composer and allowed us to make scores for several indie films that were really cool, but had, in many cases, no money to pay us. Mm-hmm. So we're working on one hand for these corporate entities, ad agencies, brands, writing music, and getting big paydays relative to these long, arduous films that we were scoring and learning as we went. and making next to nothing.
And at this point, are you still itching to get back into a band, or?
Yes. And I think during this time, I probably there was a time when I kind of moved away from rock music for a while, and I was playing lots of jazz, Latin music, Senegalese music. And so there was a time when I was probably playing in, I don't know, 6 gigging bands around Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
And then intermittently going on tour with people like Mary Timony, doing more national tours. And on one of those tours, I tried out for a band called Parts and Labor in New York. This was in 2007, and I ended up joining that band and spending a lot of time in New York and then on tour with them.
Mm-hmm. And how did you and Mary meet?
So the band that didn't work out in DC, one of the members of that band ended up playing with Mary shortly after, and then he started his own band and couldn't tour with her and suggested me for the gig.
So tell me about the Trap Set is now, 289 episodes in?
Yeah, I think that's the amount maybe more than that, maybe 290 something now.
Wow.
Yeah, we have 291 episodes now. The most recent was earlier this month with Steve Jordan.
Okay.
Great drummer.
So yeah, I think I was listening to your 100th episode where Brendan Canty is interviewing you, and you talk about the fact that you had started recording these like over a year before you started releasing them. Tell me about that.
Well, I was on tour with a guitarist called Marnie Stearn. She's now the guitarist in the 8G band on the Seth Meyers show. But at the time, she was playing her own music, which is really wild, incredible, kind of virtuosic finger tapping with almost Yoko Ono-ish vocal delivery.
Yeah, I remember when I first heard her, I thought it was just Lightning Bolt with a singer.
Right. So anyways, I was on tour with her, and I was going through some personal difficulties, and I was also just depressed and feeling disconnected from music. It was fun playing the shows, but I was questioning my life choices to become a musician. I was not getting the kind of visceral joy from listening to music that I had become accustomed to, and it was scary. And while we were driving from place to place in the van, I was listening to lots of podcasts. And after one of the tours, we were invited to an SNL taping. And one of the other people that was there was Brendan Canty, who was the drummer for Rites of Spring and Fugazi and several other bands. And he's somebody that I had known as an acquaintance, but we had a really great conversation that night. And I was kind of grilling him for information as to how he conducted his life, because from my perspective, he had done everything that I wanted to do. He was a father. He had a successful career as a filmmaker, as a composer, and of course, as a band member. And I was just asking him for advice. And it occurred to me that maybe that would make a great podcast. So he came to LA a few months later, and I recorded that first episode with him. I was really nervous, which is probably a good thing. Sheila E. on my podcast told me that when you kind of head for that nervous energy, that it's always going to be creatively fruitful, or that's the most kind of creatively fruitful territory anyway. I remember after he left the studio, my armpits were all sweaty, and it was a thrill to record it. It definitely made me nervous, but in a really healthy way. So Fugazi was a band that was very important to me. Their method of operation and their music, they represented kind of like the gold standard of what punk rock meant to me ever since I was 14. But I also wanted to explore other scenes altogether. So then for the second episode, I went to Ndugu Chancellor, who played on the Thriller album, which, as I mentioned earlier, was my first record that I owned. I kind of wanted to put those up as the flagpoles. We have the punkest of the punk and the poppiest of the pop, and let's explore all the worlds in between. And so that was kind of the goal. And I wanted to have a really great kind of first dozen episodes in the can before I launched the show so that I could be sure that I could do it on a weekly basis and that I would have a buffer built up. It was scary to think of putting something out every week at the time. And so in those first episodes, I really tried to kind of stake out an aesthetic, that was consistent with my aesthetic, but also kind of would indicate to people that went on our website what the show was all about. So that's why it took a while before we started putting them out.
Yeah. Was it a challenge to recruit guests when there was no proof of concept yet?
It was a little bit more challenging in the beginning, but one of the benefits of how we started, which was to only speak to drummers, is that drummers are the most overlooked members of the band. And they have, it was like untapped gold.
Right.
Or untapped, I don't know, is that a mixed metaphor? Uncovered gold.
Yeah.
But they were eager to talk to me in many cases.
Uh-huh.
And then once I had the first 10 or 20, the quality of folks that I had in that first run of episodes, I could just write to basically anybody and just reference our past guests. And it was easy to book from then on. And then soon after that, publicists caught on and started pitching guests to us.
Yeah. Is this, you're doing it weekly and you've been doing it weekly for, 5 years, right?
Yeah, almost 6. But
yeah.
I would, during COVID, for the first month of lockdown or so, I was doing daily episodes. And then I've been taking longer breaks in between episodes as my album has come out. And I've been wanting to devote more time to promoting that.
Right. And you do them all in person, right? Because they're local people to you?
I used to do them all in person, but then, of course, once lockdown made that impossible, I've been doing it over the phone.
Oh, okay.
Which has been fun. It's been a new way of looking at the show and, a different production style. But I think after doing over 200 in one way, it was healthy to mix it up a little bit. And it also enabled us to talk to people that I'd been meaning to talk to for years, but were just more difficult to pin down. I mean, I think the technology is there to do it remotely. And of course, Terry Gross has been doing her show largely remotely since its inception. And I would argue that she's one of the best interviewers out there.
Yeah.
But what I do like about doing it in person is being able to be in the same room as somebody else and look them in the eyes as you're asking questions and kind of read their facial expressions. And I think it makes for a richer interview in most cases.
Yeah, definitely. Tell me about the research that goes into it. I can't imagine doing it weekly and the amount of research you must have to do.
I don't do an overwhelming amount of research. In many cases, these are people that I've been a fan of for decades, so I already know a lot about them. Mm-hmm. But I also know that early on when I would do exhaustive research, it could be harmful to the conversation in that I would go in with some sort of agenda or I would know too much and there wasn't as much room for discovery. So I kind of try to do a little bit of research, but not so much that it will lead the conversation. My goal is to just be in the moment with another human being and ask them about their life.
That's a good goal. Tell me, the logo for it is also the logo for your solo album for Nite Creatures. What is the meaning of that?
What do you think?
I don't know. My thought was that it's probably a logo that was on your bass drum head at one point. Just a cool
it
design.
Is now for the first time, but
it's only the first time.
It's a symbol. I don't know. It's my symbol.
Cool. How did you arrive at it? I always like stuff like that.
I saw it in a dream, and then
sketched
it.
For real?
Yeah.
That's great. That's more meaningful than I read it in some book of glyphs or something,
No, I sketched it, and then a friend of mine who's a designer helped actually render it.
That's really cool. Do you have a name for it?
No.
So let's talk a little bit about the album. I love that it's psychedelic without being so in its own head, no pun intended for psychedelia, about being psychedelic. Like, it feels like modern psychedelia where you're not obsessed with vintage instruments or anything.
the goal that I have a lot of the time when I'm scoring or if I'm making songs is I wanted to record it in such a way where it could have been recorded 60 years ago or it could have been recorded 6 days ago. But I do think, for example, we used a real orchestra instead of using MIDI samples. But then to give it that sort of modern edge, I had the pleasure of working with Dave Fridman, who mixed the album. And I think he's one of the most, forward-thinking producers and mixers out there.
You talk about trying to know yourself at several points in your life and trying to find out what you have to offer. And does this feel like the truest expression of self for you right now?
Yes.
That's great. There's also, it seems that the music that you did on Midnight Gospel is a bridge to this. Did one thing lead to another with this type of expression? Or is it just that I saw the animation on both your video and for the series?
Well, I think Midnight Gospel, again, it's a project that came into my life at precisely the right time. And the themes of the show mirrored the themes on my album. And the aesthetic of the show was very close to my own personal aesthetic. But that said, I was pretty much done with the album. I had written it and recorded it by the time I started working on Midnight Gospel. And I was mixing it as I was scoring second or third episode of the show. And I remember that because I was at Dave Fridman's studio in New York, upstate New York, and he was mixing in one room and I was composing in the other studio. But I will say that I was working on Russian Doll at the time that I was starting the record. And that was kind of a bridge in the sense that I was really inspired watching Natasha Lyonne come into her own as an auteur. Obviously she had been a very accomplished actor by the time she made that show, but this was a really personal statement that she was leading. Watching her fight for her vision and see it to fruition was super inspiring.
Did you work as closely with Aziz as you did with Natasha?
No. Master of None was a great project, but it was not as creatively intimate as, say, Russian Doll or Midnight Gospel.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It was more like a standard TV scoring gig.
And to go back to the album briefly, how was Mary as a producer? Had you ever worked with her in that capacity before?
No, I don't think she had worked in that capacity before. But the reason I asked her to produce the album is because she's somebody who's been very prolific in her own career, both as a band member and a solo artist. We have a similar aesthetic musically. She's like a big sister to me, somebody that I really trust and who I suspected and ultimately turned out to be really positive to have around. When I was asking myself before I started making this album why it had taken me so long to make an album of my own, the answer was that I'm just such a neurotic person that I get in my own way. And the reason why I think I've been prolific as a composer for other people's projects is because that type of structure allows me to bypass my neuroses. So having a deadline and having to work quickly and not being the ultimate arbiter of whether something's working or not freed me up. And I was wondering if I could create that kind of a structure for myself, if that would help me finally make the album that I'd been wanting to make. So having Mary there was really useful for creative reasons, but also just because having somebody that I trusted to whom I would be accountable was extremely valuable. And then kind of the next step was, creating a deadline. And in order to do that, I booked time at a studio that I didn't own so that there would be a finite window in which to work. And that really helped too.
So what's next?
Man, first of all, hopefully the world won't melt.
No, I know.
Seems to be trending in that direction. But I'm working on my second album now. I want to have it out about a year after this last one has come out.
If the world has not melted by that time.
Yeah. And I'm trying to do what I can to prevent the world from melting. But, I'm also recognizing that I have much more agency over my own projects. So that's what I'm trying to funnel my energy into.
Does the new stuff still trend psychedelic?
I don't know. I mean, I don't really even, I recognize that there are things that are psychedelic about the first album, but it wasn't something I set out to do. Like, okay, I'm going to write a psychedelic album. It's just what came out. And the second album is still in the phase where it's just raw songs that have they're not necessarily styled in any way. I'm just writing the melodies right now. So who knows?
Right. I think what's fascinating about this is that it's just so unlike any of the bands you've ever played in that I've had a chance to hear.
Yeah, I mean, it's what I've heard in my head for a long time, but it was relatively complex to pull off logistically and expensive. So it wasn't really something that I could have done in my 20s necessarily. Not the way that I did it anyway. But anyway, yeah, I'm working on the second album, and then I'm scoring. I guess I have about 5 scoring projects right now.
It seems like with all the things that you've been working on, whether it's working with Mary Timony and she's producing your solo debut and she's somebody that you have played drums with before, or it's the podcasts and all the guests that you've had and who have intersected in your life in different ways, or even the scoring gigs. It seems like it must be this great opportunity to connect loose ends from this early period in your life to the present.
Sometimes it is interesting to think that I've been around the music scene for as long as I have. It was really fortunate that I discovered what I wanted to do with my life so early on, and that I had the opportunity to pursue it, albeit in this weird way. But it's great that I've met people decades ago that are still coming in and out of my life. So
it's really interesting to hear you talk about all this, the interweaving and these characters who come back and in and out of your life and your career, and how much a part of the success seems to be just keeping relationships and connecting.
I mean, I would say that keeping relationships and connecting is success. I mean, that's the reason for playing music in some ways. I mean, it's connection.
If keeping relationships and connecting is success, then Joe Wong has definitely achieved it. I mean, he's achieved it in other ways too, but His debut album is Nite Creatures, and it's out now. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Music is My Life podcast from Berklee Online. And if you're interested in learning more about Berklee Online, visit us at online.berklee.edu. And if you already know enough about Berklee Online, you'll probably want to take a course with us. And if you want to do that, we're going to let you save $100 doing so. All you got to do, visit musicismylifepod.com, and that's where you'll find all the details for the discount. This episode was edited by Talia Smith, mastered by Jose David Vindis Mora, all visual assets coordinated by Mike DeBenedictis, social media by Brooke Larson, web assistance courtesy of Mark Thomas, Steve Zimmerman, and Joe McDonough. I wrote and recorded the Music is My Life theme song, but the expert remixing comes courtesy of Lily Dickinson. Special thanks to Gabriel Reifer Cohen, Ashley Pointer, Nick Javier, Shaz Muhammad, Kate Jackson, and as I said before, thanks to you for listening. It means the world to me. Take note to join us on October 26th when our guest will be Ian and Ninja from the Go Team. Stay safe, listeners. We'll talk soon.